Hi, everyone. Welcome again to Psi Friday with Mason Winfield. Our name for ourselves is PSI Friday with Mason. That's what we call ourselves. We're not punning on anybody else's program. PSI is the Greek letter. It's like the cactus. It's the U with the I down the middle. And it's a Greek letter, psi. It's spelled PSI, but pronounced psi. It stands for psychic phenomena. Well, today I'm going to talk about something on November 17th, something I call Lovecraft country. Now, many of you may remember and maybe even be avid fans of the American horror writer Howard Phillips Lovecraft. Now, Lovecraft, he's not associated with Western New York, Providence, Rhode Island. And I believe he created this mythical community in the upper Great Lakes, which seemed to him a very spooky area. He's not the only one. But there's a Buffalo connection to Lovecraft, besides the fact that I read him avidly between about 13 and 15. Lovecraft, for those of you who don't know of him, they sometimes call him, he's sort of the successor to Edgar Allan Poe. Now, I think Poe was a really good prose stylist. He was a really good prose writer. I didn't think much of Poe as a poet. That's me. I didn't. But as a prose writer, he really set the bar for suspenseful fiction. Well written. So if Poe's the god of American horror, probably Lovecraft is the Jesus, And Lovecraft, very unusual looking guy, very reclusive, very introverted, did a lot of writing. I think he died in like 1939 at not that old, might have been 50 something. And he did a lot of writing in the short story form for a magazine called Weird Tales. And Weird Tales, it was what they call pulp fiction. And the reason they call it pulp is because whenever the books were unsold, and they would very often have stacks of boxes of them, they would grind them up into pulp and reuse them for something. But Lovecraft was notorious for creating this really cool mythology. They call it the Cthulhu mythos. And a mythos is kind of it's a pseudo mythology. In other words, it's not a mythology that was made by an ancient society. It's a mythology that's young. It might be the creation of just a handful of people. It's nothing that was ever presumed to be religion. Got that? Yeah, that's probably the difference. But the Cthulhu mythos is based around the idea that in another dimension outside the earth is a host of evil, heartless, demonic, monstrous beings that have dramatic powers, and that once they ruled the world and our solar system, maybe the universe, and another group of godly beings, I think they call them the elder gods, maybe that's what they call them, but they threw out Cthulhu and all the baddies and shoved them out of the universe into this other dimension. But since then, these beings have retired, and the bad guys are trying to get back into the world. It's a haunting mythos. And all the legends about the devil and the fairies and the werewolves and the vampires, and every monstrous, sinister being in folklore and mythology of any land is presumed to be the servants of these evil gods trying to get back into the world. Well, there's a Buffalo connection to Lovecraft. And even though there's a possibility that Lovecraft's dad may have been born in Rochester, I've heard it said, I've read it written. I've never proved that to my own satisfaction, that I would tell you, yeah, he's from Rochester. But at any rate, there was a a watchman, a night watchman in Buffalo. The guy's name was William Lumley, Lumley. And I've done some tracking of this William Lumley, and it appears that he may have been descended of a family of saloon owners, because about 30, 40 years before he enters the city records, or there's any Williams there that could have been him, there are a couple of other Lumleys there, and they all have something to do with the saloon, probably in the old First Ward on the water side. And Lumley, his occupation is listed as watchman, and he was obviously night watchman at a chemical company. I think they call it the Persico Company. It was right on the grounds of a school today in Buffalo. I think it might be City Honors, which has moved around a few times. So the long and the short of it is that this character starts writing fan letters to the greater writer, Lovecraft, about his Cthulhu mythos. And Lumley goes, you're right on. You're a prophet of the coming peril. And for Lovecraft, this is just fun stuff, fun and games, And a bunch of other writers of Lovecraft's era, Robert Bloch, Robert E. Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, Algernon Blackwood, a couple of other writers picked up on the Cthulhu mythos, and they were writing along with it. So, and these guys were always having a repartee with each other. And not only would Lumley write to Lovecraft, but Lovecraft be writing to his buddies about this weirdo in Buffalo who believes his stories are true. And the guy in Buffalo, Lumley, believes Lovecraft's right about the elder gods because he, Lumley, has explored the landscape in Western New York. He's camped out in hidden valleys, in mysterious woods, among ancient pre-human cities. He's seen artifacts that had to precede Homo sapiens. He's seen mysterious white spirits rising from the ruins of these ancient cities. And he says he sees it all in the Western New York landscape. And Lovecraft is writing to his buddies and going, well, this guy's a little wacky. And if a horror writer, I know a lot of horror writers now, most of them are really cool people. They get a bad stereotype. They tend to be really nice, gentle, cool people. Lovecraft was himself a little unusual. And if Lovecraft thinks Lumley is weird, Lumley was one bent boyo. He was a solo camping cowboy. But there's another connection here in Buffalo. And I think Lumley died, maybe as recently as 1960, because there is a grave marked for Lumley, and surprisingly close to the current era. But there's another connection. There's a bridge in the town of Elma. Now, Elma is east of Buffalo, north of East Aurora, but real close to both. There's a bridge out there on Bowen Road and Woodard, railroad track bridge, And I've been driving by it for years. And then one day, probably 10 years ago, I noticed that there's graffiti. Somebody's taken a silk screen and some spray paint and done a bunch of faces across the front of the viaduct from both sides. And on the abutment underneath it, on these massive concrete that's holding it up, there's more of these. And this time, the man's face in the stencil is on top of this tentacled being. It's like they took the head of a man and put it on top of a morphed octopus. And I don't think people know who that is. Well, it's Lovecraft. It's from the most famous portrait of Lovecraft. Somebody made a silkscreen out of it and decked the bridge with graffiti. And I have got some pictures I've taken of this bridge, and I'll put it up here. So for this episode of Psi Friday, you can see the stencil, you can see the bridge. And I hope it stays there a while, because it's just this unique, spontaneous eruption of, there's a Lovecraft fan somewhere in those hills. But there are two fundamentalist Christian churches on the same road within a mile. And I think if they knew who this was, it wouldn't be Lovecraft country anymore. I think they'd get some paint bombs and they'd be gone, which would be a sad day for me. But anyway, my friends, thanks for joining us on Psi Friday, November 17th. This is Mason Winfield representing the research organization Spirit Way Project, of whom more to come.